Hi, welcome to another episode of the Move, Talk, Thrive podcast. Today, Em and I are unpacking assessments. I am on an epic journey at the moment to put together a protocol for exercise physiologists, and Em has been exploring assessments in more detail and just asking questions about how they do things, which is so amazing. So I cannot wait to share this conversation with you today on all things assessments.
I'm Lizzie Dawson, Australian exercise physiologist.
I'm Emily Mackey, Australian speech pathologist.
And this is the Move, Talk, Thrive podcast.
Hello, Em, how are you?
Hi everyone. Hi Lizzie. I am going well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Season 3, super exciting. I'm so excited about this season.
I know. I am too. Like, we have so many good gold nuggets coming out, but from our guests, and our guests are just absolutely amazing, aren't they?
I know. I've learned so much from them. I'm actually excited to listen this season. So can't wait.
It's going to be good. So what we thought we would do is do like mix up the guests and then a little bit of us as well, didn't we?
Yeah.
So we'll do some episodes like today, which is all about assessments, which is just me and you. And then we'll next episode we'll have a guest and, just mix it up a little bit.
Yeah, so good.
Opinions and other people's voices. And we've also got people from different industries and industries that are so not related to allied health. I don't even think a lot of them knew what we did, but it's actually so refreshing to hear how different people do things and view things. And we all can kind of work together. So it's really exciting.
I think you and I have learnt so much from other industries. Like, it's just been part of our journey, hasn't it? Like, looking to other industries and what they're doing and then challenging if we can do it in our own industry. And so I think it's pretty special that we get to share that with our audience.
I think back to like pivotal moments in, I think more so business, because that's when I only really started talking to other industries. When I was a clinician, I just didn't have that mindset. So if you're a clinician not in business, you can have that mindset. But my biggest pivotal moments or breakthroughs have come when I have implemented something from another industry and put it in, and it's just gone like, whoa, like this really works, but we've just never thought to try it. So yes, so much we can learn.
Yeah, amazing. And I'm so excited to talk about assessments today because it's something that I have been doing a deep dive in, and then I think you have more recently as well.
Yeah, well, it's really funny. I think we started talking about this conversation because, like with speechies, we learn about assessments at uni. It's very drilled into us. And if anything, at uni, we get more exposure to assessments than actual therapy. So speechies come out going, I've done this assessment, this assessment, this assessment. And then I say, well, how do you analyze that? How do you interpret the data? And they go, And I go, how do you get a therapy plan from that? They go, So if anything, the assessments are really focused on at uni. Or standardized assessments. And I thought that was the same for every allied health professional. And then when I was talking to you about it, you said EPs don't do assessments. And I was like, what?
Well, it's not that we don't do assessments, it's that we don't know. Like, one of my most commonly asked questions from my community in the pediatric community is, how do we assess children and how do we keep children engaged during assessments? So I think at uni, we don't really do anything around peds. So we're not doing anything around peds, but then we're definitely not doing assessments. And there is actually not, there's not a lot of standardized assessments that we would be aware of. Like, I've really had to go digging to find what would be relevant for us and then finding normative data. And so I think it's just really challenged me to look at things that maybe a little bit differently. And then when we were talking, you were kind of saying that there was like a set structure for assessments from uni, and you were actually starting to challenge that as well and look at things a little bit more differently. So it just kind of opened a can of worms when we were chatting, and we were like, let's do this for a podcast episode.
We come from such like we're both allied health professionals, but we come from such different backgrounds.
Mm.
And I feel like as a speechy, it's very standardized driven.
Yeah.
And I guess that's one thing that we are looking to try to change, not change, but bring a bit of balance to, because standardized assessments, they're not the be all and end all. And when we're looking at standardized assessments, we only have a limited range to choose from. And where do those assessments get their standardization from? So often they get their standardization from like a certain type of race of children, a certain type of children from a certain country, children like they might be only bilingual children, they might be of a certain age. And then if you're then trying to put that assessment onto any other child that doesn't fit with that standardized population, then it doesn't work. But we have to do that as species because there's no other option. And we do need some standardization, like specifically for funding purposes, because the standardization gives us a diagnosis. So if we're talking about language, which is what my specialty is online, we would say like a moderate or severe receptive or expressive language delay, disorder, or difficulties, depending on which language you're using. And so you can't get that diagnosis without standardization. But you know, whether that assessment was appropriate for the child or not, it's unclear. But if you get that, then that's going to get a child funding because they need a clear-cut diagnosis.
Yeah.
But you know, there's so many limitations with standardized assessments.
Yeah. And I think the difference for us is that we're not diagnosing. So I actually think that that's an opportunity because it means that we don't have to be like confined by using the standardized assessments, I think. And I think you and I both spoke, not just EPs, but across the board, we really need a nice range of, you know, observation and standardized testing too, that has kind of normative data attached to it. So I think, it's just about like opening people's minds up to a more balanced approach.
Yeah, or I mean, the language that researchers use is having a dynamic assessment approach. When I actually look at a dynamic assessment approach, I go, oh, is that really realistic for practice? And is that really realistic for, you know, 60 minutes to 60 to 90 minute session, or, you know, 2 60-minute sessions? It's difficult. So I always err on the side of being practical and aligning practicality with the research and trying to be as gold standard as possible, but also practical, because gold standard would be a dynamic assessment.
Yeah.
So I more use the language of having a comprehensive assessment, just because I feel like that is a bit more realistic. I hope we can get to having a dynamic assessment process, but a comprehensive assessment process does do a bunch of other things as well. So do you want to talk about what you would do? Because obviously what you do with adults is different to what you would do with kids as an EP, right?
Absolutely.
So got more data on adults.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say about that research piece. So I have invested in the team at the University of Queensland at the moment to independently assess my program for the development of kindy age children across cognitive, social, emotional, and gross motor progress. And so one thing that came up in those discussions and the planning was that just because an assessment is going to get us the data that we want to make sure that it's practical in terms of implementation with a 3 to 5 year old in a kindy environment, because that's what we're doing. So I just wanted to, note that, you know, there's standardized assessments that are all research backed and obviously going to be really important for diagnosis, and there's a place for them, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be the most practical process of gathering that information, which is why we need to kind of look at multiple ways to do it and open our minds and start this conversation, I think.
And one of the biggest factors with your assessment is taking into consideration the family and taking into consideration with that cultural background. So, this is interesting because you and I were talking about this as well. With the cultural background, I think specifically when you're looking at factors, cultural background plays a huge role because culture dictates a lot of how children are brought up. So how they're fed. It's also with their gross motor milestones. Like a lot of Asian backgrounds will not put their children on the floor to crawl because they think it's dirty, which maybe from their countries it was, but in Australia it's different. But they still continue those traditions in Australia. So they won't put them on the floor to crawl or sit. And they'll just let them go when they're walking. And so if you've got a child that comes in for an assessment and the parents go, oh, they didn't crawl, they didn't walk, or they crawled at like 12 months because that's when the parents thought they were comfortable to put them down, you might go, oh, not red flags, that's bad terminology. That's old terminology. But like this might be a difficulty for them. But when you actually understand the cultural background, you go, you're being raised by the grandparents. That's what they do in that culture. So that's something we need to have sensitivity to and think about. And
I thought that was so fascinating when you said that. I went back and told all my team, I'm like, oh my gosh, because I just wouldn't have thought of that.
And it's the same with food and eating as well. Like my cultural background is that my dad is Indian Malaysian. So he grew up in Malaysia and my mum is Australian. So I have been exposed to that Indian culture in a way, like my dad has always lived in Australia and we have as well. But when I go back to Malaysia, it was really interesting. I did a trip there maybe a year or so ago with my little kids, and my auntie asked me why my children were feeding themselves. And like Evie was 3 at this time, and she said, why is Evie feeding herself? Because in their culture, they don't let their children touch the food or feed themselves until they go to school, which is 5 or 6. And so that is a very defining cultural thing for feeding, particularly speech pathologists when we're assessing feeding, that if a child has never been allowed to touch the food, play with the food, explore the food, feed themselves, like even with the hand-eye coordination and the fine motor, they potentially have never been given the opportunity, rather than it being a delay or a difficulty. And so then my little cousin's child who was 6 or 7 then sat there and they were fed completely like off the spoon. It was very, very different experience. And that's just another example of it being an Asian background and different cultural customs that people have.
Yes. So interesting. Interesting. So at what point in your assessment are you asking that information?
Well, it depends. Like that would sort of go under our case history. So what it is, it's where exploring and really getting down to the nitty gritty with the parents, like what they do at home, what their expectations are of their child, what their milestones were, like other languages that they speak. So typically we actually do that at the end of an assessment. Oh, no, actually, sorry. We get the parents to fill out the case history form before they come in. Like we send it through on an email so that parents can do that. Parents sometimes fill it out in the waiting area if they haven't done it. And then the speechy will capitalize on the child's attention when we first go into the assessment, and they will work with the child. And then once the child is feeling fatigued and we've got enough information as we can, then we will set them up with some toys or activities, and then we'll chat to the parents at the end about the case history. Like we're always talking to the parents throughout and that type of thing and asking them questions. But in terms of going through their form and going through and asking questions, the main thing is we don't make it different. We don't make it seem different. We just are really saying to the parents, we're really just trying to understand how your family lives, what you value, what you think is important, to be able to make the most accurate call of where your child is for their age. And I think the thing that they need to understand, which most parents do, is that we are looking at comparing their child to Australian children, their age. And so sometimes that can work and sometimes it doesn't work. So we just are educating the parents on, okay, well, this is what other children in the classroom are going to be doing at this age. your child is not doing that because of this, whether it's a cultural thing or whether it actually is a difficulty, or whether we then have to say to them, we need to give a little bit of therapy first, and then we'll be able to make a call. Because children who often, so I had a little one once, and she came in for an assessment, and she had just moved from India, and she had never been exposed to English, and they put her in a preschool, and the preschool had sent the referral saying she's not understanding anything. And I was like, well, because she's never been exposed to English. So what I was trying to do in my assessment was actually determine whether it was an actual language difficulty or whether she just wasn't exposed to English. And as it was more not exposure to English rather than a difficulty. But it took me a couple of sessions to figure that out, because she learnt really quickly.
I was going to say, hold for a second. How do you figure that out if she's not, communicating in our language? How do you actually?
So I got an interpreter, which was her mother. I got her mother to interpret, because I pretty soon realized that in the standardized assessment, it was all zeros. And I was like, I'm pretty sure this girl can do more than this. It's just because I'm presenting it in English. And when I figured it out, I was like, oh, she's never been exposed to English. So I was like, right. And so I would get the mother to do it. And as soon as the mother presented it, she was doing it really well. And so to me, she's actually not behind because of a difficulty. Like, she's actually age appropriate in her native language. So what I did was I just consulted with the parents, and I said, look, I can actually accelerate her by giving her a bit of exposure to structured English. And then once I did that, then she just took off and thrived, and she didn't need any more sessions after that. Like, we just did basic language goals. But I was like, she actually is learning really well in her primary language. So that is okay. And that is completely normal. That is what we want her to be doing. And it's, I guess, with any of these things, it's looking at, has the child been given the opportunity to learn and explore that skill and do it, or have they not? And if they have been given the opportunity and they're not doing it, okay, then that's our role. We come in and we are assessing. If they haven't been given an opportunity, well, of course, they're not going to be doing what we want them to be doing.
Yeah. So interesting. And so I think, a huge part of that, and something that we've been exploring at Kids Heart Pilates, is the information gathering, like getting all the information. So what we've actually done, which I think is a little bit different to what you do, is we have the admin find out, like, obviously make the booking, get all their details, and then find out more about the child. So, what, like, our question is, tell me about your child. And that seems to be like the key to finding out a lot of the information. Then we split our initial assessment up into two parts, and we have a phone consult with the practitioner that is taking the child for their assessment, and the parent, where the practitioner is finding out all the information. So we would go through diagnosis, preferences, presentations, sleep habits, dietary habits or concerns, obviously lifestyle and physical activity. Go through all of that information. We find that we get better information when we're talking to the parent it's not in front of the child, because we find that particularly when we're seeing children, they've usually got a diagnosis and they've been through all of this a million times. So the parents become quite sensitive to their child hearing them talk about their, difficulties and concerns. So we have that in a phone consult, and then we'll have face-to-face with them for half an hour, where we've kind of set up the environment and ourselves and what assessments we want to do based on that conversation. I've actually just developed a pre-assessment checklist and a post-assessment checklist for my team. It's also on my website, so I'll pop the link in the show notes. But it's basically my concern when we started was not so much about what we're assessing. It was being able to confidently walk into that assessment and know that we've set ourselves and the child up for success. So knowing, have they had sensory profiling done? Who are they What health professionals are they seeing? Can we get in touch with those health professionals before our session and see what works and doesn't work in those sessions? What reports can we get? Like, all of this information sets us and them up for success so that we can actually do an assessment and we can engage the child. Because I think that's the primary piece in those sessions, those initial sessions, is the rapport and engagement so that we can actually do an assessment. So that's kind of where I've started, was that initial like information gathering was and doing, and this is just kind of what we've learned along the way, and then getting them in. And now the journey that we're kind of going on is, right, what do we need? What information do we need to be capturing in that initial assessment? And we're mixing that between standardized assessments and observation, and kind of aligning that to the goals that have been voiced from the parents or the NDIS plan. So what I've put together is the pre and post checklist, and then an assessment planner as well for my team. And now we get to the next stage, which is actually putting the kind of assessment protocols together. So but yours is a bit different to that.
Yeah, no, I think it is similar. It is pretty similar. Like and I'm sure you would also do this as well, or it might already be there. It's so different because they normally see us at the start and you at the end, like you're saying. So you have so much to go from, whereas we're often the first point of call. Not all the time, but most.
How long do your initial assessments go for?
Oh, it really varies on the child. We sort of generally, a minimum would be an hour. And that would be like if a child is very, very basic with their skills and there's not really much to go off, like it's all just parent information. But for school-aged kids, 2 hours and longer as a minimum as well, because there's so much to assess with the school-aged children. But what I was going to say was, so obviously we do teacher questionnaires, because it's always impossible to get the teacher on a phone call. So we do teacher questionnaires, parent questionnaires. We've got the sensory profiling, child preferences as well. So we get all that filled out before. I think what you said before is really key, and I don't think I understood the importance of this until I became a mum, was actually talking about the child's results in front of the child. And so often as professionals, particularly as new grads, we can be so focused on what we're doing and the time and the assessments. And I'm totally guilty of this, that I would then just share, and I didn't even have a thought for the child and how they were receiving it. Bear in mind, like a lot of our children, if they're coming in with moderate to severe language difficulties, they may not be understanding anyway, but you still can't take that for granted. And so I think we have changed, particularly now, like, so always with school-age children, we always will say, do you want to talk about this like later, or should we step out of the room? Or like the child will go and sit with the admin, because we don't want to destroy a child's confidence with how we speak in front of them. However, sometimes with some of the older kids, we do talk about the assessments results to them with the parent there. So we will say, hey, like, you did really well with this spelling, these spelling words, but these ones you were finding really difficult. Like, look at your words here. This is how we'd spell them. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to work with you. Are you all right to come to therapy once a week? And we're going to work on these words or work on this reading to really help you get better at school. And then I would really talk to the child and say, like, what do you want to work? Like, what do you want to work on? Why do you want to work on these things? I really need you to be engaged in therapy, and that's how we're going to work together and improve. So I would do that with my older children, have that conversation. But yeah, with the littlies, you've got to be really careful. Like, so 2 to 3 years, and it's getting creative with your session. So whether it is a phone call after, or whether, because a 2-year-old, you can't just say, like, go and sit with the admin. So it's just being really creative. Or I think, if anything, asking permission to the parents, saying, are you okay if I talk about the child's difficulties in front of them now? Like, for the most part, like, that's fine, because that's what they do with doctors and things. But I think it's just having that sensitivity to ask the parents. Because we don't want to be speaking negative words repetitively over a child. Particularly if they're coming to us to have help, that could destroy that if they hear you speaking like that. So I think it's important, new grads and students and those without children, please be aware of that.
Yeah,
And make sure that you're creating a really healthy, safe environment with that element of assessments.
totally. Absolutely. And I think, just listening to, you talking about the assessments that you're doing and, 2-hour block of assessment, a really thorough assessment, and the information that you're gathering, like my message to exercise physiologists, if you are, and generally we are further down the line in terms of when we're intercepting a child, reach out to those other health professionals and, or those reports the parents will generally have. So making sure that you're getting that information. And I think what we have discovered through our practice is the information that the parents provide with our admin team is very different to the information that they're providing the clinician with. So, and that's why, we try and get as much information through our admin team, but then we get the clinician to call before, introduce themselves, which is also kind of quite nice. And then, and then get that additional information. They just seem to share different information with the clinician. And again, it just all feeds in to that setting yourself up for that successful initial appointment. Because if that doesn't happen, it can be hard. But I think we can lean into what has previously been done. But you guys, not so much.
No. And I think that's an important point as well. Like I completely agree with what you just said then. Yeah, it's like just try and lean in to as much as you can. Yeah, I completely agree. What I would say, taking it back just quickly, there's one more point I want to say with the standardized assessments. So, like obviously we have to work with what we have, and no standardized assessment is going to be perfect. So we have to accept that. But really, when we're using a standardized assessment, what we have to be careful of is overdiagnosing, underdiagnosing, which means children are slipping through the cracks. So the way that you can sort of address that or look at that is when we're looking at a standardized assessment, we can look at the sensitivity of an assessment and the specificity of an assessment. And so really, from what I can gather, I'm not a researcher, so if there's researchers out there listening, correct me if I'm wrong, but we really want to get an assessment that is 80% or more sensitive and hits that with specificity. I think it's okay. Obviously, like I said, there's not many assessments. It's my theory of language I'm looking at that hit that or meet that. So if that's the case, then it's just being aware with your assessments that is this a highly sensitive assessment, or is this not specific enough, and then just using that to help form what you say to parents and how you would work in therapy and looking at the diagnosis. And I think it's particularly important with children that are on the borderline. I don't know if you have this, Lizzy, because your children are more complex, but when we have children come in and they're on the borderline of on their percentile rank, so they might be borderline mild or borderline within normal range, being very, very careful there. I wouldn't be discharging a child or saying they don't need therapy when they're on that borderline range, because of the specificity and the sensitivity. They're not like where they need to be, which is 80% or more. And I would sort of be saying we probably do need to be providing therapy for these children to get them up in their percentile rank. So being up to be more in line with children, to be more in line with more children their own age, so that we're then more confident, because we just know that gap with standardized assessments. So that's just a really important point to consider there, that not like we said, assessments aren't the be all and end all, but we just need to be really careful of how we're interpreting.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point to make, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think that's something that uni brushes over a bit, but we don't really understand it. and we don't really know how to apply it to the practical world. And there are loads of documents out there where, like, if you were to type in like, or it's in all the manuals for the assessments, but if you didn't want to go through the manual, you could just type in like self P3, which is a language assessment that we have for speeches, and you could type in like sensitivity and specificity, and I'm sure you get some documents up there from different research institutions or things like that you could understand and know. And there's like, because we target so many different areas, there's so many different assessments. I keep talking about language because that's my jam, but you know, we have assessments for literacy, we have assessments for pronunciation or speech sounds, we have assessments for voice, you know, so there's all different types, but this is a principle that you can apply across all standardized assessments. And we just have to be okay. Like, a lot of speeches then get a little bit stuck because they're like, oh, like what is it? Paralysis analysis. Because you're like, oh, nothing's perfect, nothing's good enough. And it's like, well, this is why it's so important to do standardized assessment. And then to make up for that lack of sensitivity and specificity, then we have the parent chats, we have the classroom or the teacher chats, then we have you know, the case history, we have the cultural considerations, we have the consideration, like with language, whether they're an analytical language processor or gestalt language processor. So we have all these different considerations, and then that is what then makes the comprehensive assessment and puts on the standardized assessment.
Can you just talk quickly about that? Is it gestalt?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah.
That was like a key message that I took back to my team, which now I've forgotten, but can you just go over that? Because I think that's actually really relevant. And maybe just anything else that you think, you know, might be relevant for other allied health professionals in terms of language. I've got two questions for you. Firstly, that can you go over that, is it a learning type?
Yes. Language processing. Yeah.
And how that would apply to other allied health professionals.
Yes.
Like just an awareness, I think, is really important.
So you've got, when we're looking at children, you've got neurotypical children or neurodiverse children. So that's your new language. So neurotypical is children who are developing appropriately, or not even developing appropriately, but they don't have an additional diagnosis. Typically neurodiverse children are children that are autistic, Down syndrome, any sort of diagnosis, Fragile X syndrome, but also they might not have a diagnosis, but they're just not learning in the typical neurotypical way or presenting in the neurotypical way. So it's your two lingos there. With that, when we're talking about language, so language underpins everything. So, you know, if you're an EP and giving an assessment, and I don't know what you'd say, you might say stand on one foot. I don't know. Do you? Or hold out your hands. Children actually need to be able to understand and follow that instruction, which is like the verb stand, the quantity one, and foot is vocab, which is a body part. So they need to understand those three different types. So language is underpinning. Like I would just encourage you, if you're a professional, to think about the type of language that you're using with the child, and maybe you need to incorporate a question, like making sure that you've checked their language ability, whether it's with a speechy or with the parent, before you're administering an assessment. Because if the child is not understanding what you're asking them to do, you're not going to get anything out of them. Or if they can't talk to you and tell you, like if you're a physio and you're saying, are you in pain? And they don't understand that concept or that question, how are they actually going to give you accurate response? But when children are learning language, at the moment, this is the current research and it's still developing. So, you know, it could change. You've got analytical language processes or gestalt language processes. So gestalt could also be referred to as gestalt. It's just how you're saying it with your lingo. But analytical language processes are children that, you know, learn in a very structured way, very methodically. You know, if we're looking at, you know, they might say one word and then they'll put two words and then they'll say three words, and it's very hierarchical the way that they learn. A gestalt language processor, so it's not a diagnosis, it's not a disorder, it's just the way that they process language and how they then will communicate language, is they communicate through scripting, or they'll communicate with echolalia, which is tends to be a trait of being autistic, and they'll repeat back things that they've heard. So for example, a child might come into a session and they might say to infinity and beyond, which is a Buzz Lightyear statement. Yeah. But they have picked up that statement, they've honed onto that, And for whatever reason, that's them communicating and expressing maybe that they're happy to be here, or that's their way of saying hello. And so gestalt language processes, they communicate with scripts, and it is a little bit more of a complex communication process because, well, as species, our job is to figure out what those scripts are, which they're gestalts. We call them gestalts. That's that script, what that gestalt is, interpret that, and then we try and build therapy around that. So if we're looking at like a gestalt language learner, we more take a really big bird's eye view of all of their communication and then look down. An analytical language processor, we start at the bottom. It's very small, and then we build it up like a tree. So it's just how we look at it. But I guess if you're an allied health professional and you've got a child coming in and they are like very echolalic, so like if I say to them, put the toys away, they might then a couple of minutes later say, put the toys away, like they're not speaking. They're not actually functionally saying like, hello, how are you today? But they're just repeating different phrases and statements. I think it's to be aware of that if you're an allied health professional, and know that there's a difference, and they need to, obviously they should be seeing a physiologist if that's happening. But there's a lot of new research coming out about it because it has been very unknown, this area, for a long time. But if you know any autistic children, you might be thinking, oh, that's them. Like it is a very common thing of how they communicate.
Yeah.
It's just, I guess it's just being aware of it, then talking to the parents about, are they seeing a speech pathologist? They should be. Educating the parents. You can get lots of information online about it. And I guess it's adjusting your therapy. Is it appropriate for you to be giving therapy at that time, like as an EP or a physio or OT, and looking at really how you can collaborate?
Exactly. I was going to say, and if that is the case and they are seeing a speechy, can we get in contact with the speechy? Because you guys will have basically decoded it, right? Like,
for the most part, depending on, I mean, the thing is, it's a very different way to learn language. So they change all the time, but and that's in a good way. But yes, for the most part, yes.
But then that would influence how we would then provide instruction and intervention, which I think is really important.
Yeah. And just because they are not expressing doesn't mean that they are not understanding as well, the receptive component. So that's really key there, that the understanding component and the expressive component. But I honestly, though, think like that's a whole nother kettle of fish, talking about neurodiverse children, looking at gestalt language processes, looking at autistic children. Like that is a whole different way and therapy model of how you would work with those children. So I would just encourage you, if you've got children like that in your case, so you do need to be educated. You do need to be empowering with those children. And there's lots of resources out there that you can get.
Because that's the other, absolutely. Because that's the other thing that keeps popping up for me, because my goal is to come up with a protocol. So exercise physiologists have got a protocol that's got a bunch of assessments in it, that has got normative data, and we can assess children confidently. However, while I'm on this journey, something that's popping up for me is, okay, we've got normative data, but that's for like typically developing children. What about majority of the children that are coming in to see us and are not typically developing? So the normative data doesn't even apply to them. So then when we're doing an assessment, it doesn't even matter if we've got the normative data, right? Because we're just really assessing on where they're at and setting goals based around where our goals are. A practitioner are then collaborating with the parental goals and the plan goals. So, like, can we take the pressure off the standardized testing and the normative data in that respect? Because that's just not fair for them almost.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You cannot do that. You cannot do a standardized assessment generally with those children.
Yeah.
To be honest, we used to do that, but it's not neuroaffirming to do that.
No.
So there's a whole different assessment protocol for that.
Right.
Yes.
So interesting, because I really think, like, I get so many questions like, what do we do for an assessment? We need to do assessment, blah, 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 blah. And so I'm on this journey to get the assessment. And then I'm like, wait a second, I found a little problem here, because, we all want the normative data and we all want to, be able to label almost like whether they're, meeting milestones or whatever. But the children that are being referred to us are not. So,
hence why they're being referred.
Exactly. So I just think that that's been like a big eye opener for me in terms, and yeah, when we were talking about it and you were sharing about the gestalt learning, I was like, we so need to know that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it is, I would say it's not a new concept, not at all, but it is pretty new in terms of the treatment, the therapy, and it is still conflicting. I think this is where we've got to look at the personal experience. So, like researchers, I learned this the other day. I was listening to a podcast. Researchers always come with their own bias to something, or they're wanting to prove something. That's why they've brought it to research. And so you've got to also acknowledge that the researcher has a certain bias, but we can never discount personal experience. And so what's happening now, after so many years of treatment and therapies that have been harmful for children, because we've been trying to treat all children as analytical language processors. And I look back at so many moments in my early career, and I think I didn't even know, like, none of this stuff existed. And I would be doing PLA, which is an analytical language process. I'd be doing the PLA with children who were GLP, gestalt language processors, and finding that it wasn't working. But it didn't exist. Like, gestalt language processors didn't exist. Or if I'm sure it did, but it wasn't like known or, researched thoroughly. So it's still a developing area. But we have to take into account these personal experiences, which is the personal experiences are coming out saying that was harmful for me. Like I worked better this way, or my brain wasn't given the space to function the way it needed to. And that's a whole nother podcast episode as well. We were talking about social things as well. But I think the thing is, you've got to look at the lived experience, and you've got to look at the child or the person sitting in front of you, the family sitting in front of you, and going, how does this work personally for this person? Like, this is their life. This is their child. This child is the world to them. This is their family. How can we do need the research, and we do need the past, but we need to always be looking at the future to what the functional goals and the functional outcomes are. And then that helps us to have that sensitivity and go, okay, so I'm going to choose this or do this because we're looking to the future with you, which I can see the future with you is bright, because I can see you having a conversation, being an adult, functioning adult, blah, blah, blah. So it's taking into account that, and then moving forward and trying our best to have that account for the personal experience to try and do good over harm, which obviously is what we all want to do.
Yeah.
But there's so many things to consider with an assessment. Like, there's so much more there, but
I feel like we could talk all day about this.
All
day. So
like, you can continue to learn about assessments. Like you mentioned, Lizzy, you've got your pre and post assessment checklist on your website. I just like last week I did a working webinar for speeches where I talked about this assessment process in the webinar. And then I also have developed some goal selection templates on how to choose your goals. So once
that looks so good.
Thank you, Lizzy.
So good. Yeah. I keep seeing it on Instagram. I'm like, okay, I need to do this too.
Thank you. Well, I mean, because I think that's the thing, right? We've just spoken about all assessments. So you get hyped up on assessments, but the whole point of an assessment, the assessment is not the end goal. The assessment is to take you into a therapy plan so that you can provide therapy to the child and improve their skills. So often we do an assessment, we get so much data, like we've spoken about, there's so much information to get, you get really overwhelmed and you go, oh my gosh, okay, now I've got all this information. Where do I start? How do I get myself out of this information into implementation? So I've developed the goal selection guide, which is how do I actually choose which goal to target first and why, and what's the clinical reasoning behind that? So my webinar was about that, and it was very practical. Like, that's why I called it a working webinar. We went through and I just actually mapped out my thought process. When I'm doing an assessment, we used a case study, and I was like, this is why I think this is what I did this. I showed the research, and I showed like how it actually gets to that point of choosing a clinically sound goal to start in therapy. And then I've got another template that's just about to come out, which is then once you've chosen the goal, how do you plan the therapy session? So they're sort of 3 things that you can grab from my website, which is the working webinar, the goal selection guide, and the therapy plan starter.
Amazing. And I just now have thought we need an episode on setting goals for our clients.
Yeah. Okay. Let's
write it down.
And let's do that next time. Stay tuned for that one.
Yeah. So good.
But yeah, so you can grab our resources from both of our websites, depending on what professional you are and the children that you're working with.
And we'll put them in show notes too.
Yes, we'll put them in the show notes. And thank you so much for listening. We hope that this has been helpful and enlightening, whether you're at the start of your journey or you've been doing assessments for many years. We hope it's been a refreshing conversation for you. And if you have any questions, like we say, please send us a message, or please leave us a review. We'd love to know what you love and what you're learning. And until next time, stay tuned.